Behind the image of confidence, pride, and control often hides a deep feeling of emptiness. It is a space they spend their lives trying to fill, but never truly can. More than anything, they want to control not only situations, but also the people who genuinely care about them. Why does this happen? Because a narcissist's sense of worth does not come from inner peace or real confidence. It depends almost entirely on outside validation. They constantly need admiration, attention, agreement, or even conflict to keep their fragile self-image alive. Without that endless stream of emotional reactions, the mask they have built begins to crack. That is exactly why creating emotional distance affects them so deeply. When you step back and stop playing their emotional games, you do something they struggle to understand. You quietly take your power back. This is not about yelling, arguing, or trying to prove a point. Those reactions still feed the very cycle they depend on. They draw energy from every emotional response, whether it is love, anger, frustration, or fear. What truly unsettles them is something much quieter. It is your genuine indifference. The moment you stop reacting, stop explaining yourself, and stop allowing their behavior to control your emotions, something changes. Their words lose their impact. Their actions no longer shake your confidence. Even their presence begins to lose its influence over you. That silent shift touches the deepest fear they carry, the possibility that they may not be as important as they have always believed. Stay with this idea, because what happens next explains why emotional freedom becomes so powerful. If you look closely, you will notice that a narcissist often treats relationships like transactions instead of real emotional connections. They rarely see people as individuals with independent thoughts, feelings, and personal value. Instead, they see what each person can provide. When you admire them, they feel important. When you argue with them, they feel powerful because they know they still control your attention. Even if you strongly dislike them, they may still feel satisfied because your emotions remain focused on them. But emotional detachment creates a completely different outcome. It tells them they no longer have influence over your daily life. For someone who depends on controlling the emotional atmosphere around them, this is incredibly difficult to accept. They cannot easily process the idea that someone who once reacted so strongly now remains calm, steady, and emotionally unavailable. That quiet response speaks louder than any argument ever could. It silently says that your peace matters more than winning a battle. It shows that your attention is no longer something they can demand whenever they choose. And that realization can become one of the greatest challenges to the image they have carefully protected for years. Keep watching, because this next part reveals why that simple change affects them much more deeply than most people realize. Creating emotional distance also forces them to face a reality they spend enormous energy trying to avoid. It reminds them that you are your own person. You exist outside the world they tried to build around you. Once you stop responding to manipulation, guilt, blame, or emotional pressure, their familiar strategies begin to lose their power. This becomes frightening because it challenges the story they constantly tell themselves. They want to believe they are always in control, always more important, always able to influence the people around them. But when you calmly walk away without needing revenge or constant explanations, that story begins to fall apart. Your independence becomes evidence that they never controlled your identity as much as they imagined. They may try different tactics, changing their tone, becoming unusually kind, creating confusion, or even provoking conflict just to see if they can still pull you back into the same emotional pattern. They are watching closely, hoping that something will still work. But every moment you remain calm, sends a clear message that your emotional life now belongs to you. That quiet confidence becomes stronger than any dramatic confrontation because it cannot be manipulated as easily. And that is exactly why emotional freedom often speaks louder than words ever could. There is another powerful truth hidden beneath all of this. Emotional distance is not only about protecting yourself from another person's behavior, it is also about rebuilding your own sense of value. As long as someone controls your reactions, they continue influencing your inner world. Every argument, every attempt to prove yourself, every effort to gain their understanding keeps that connection alive. But the moment you stop seeking their approval, something important changes inside you. You begin deciding how you feel instead of allowing someone else to decide it for you. Your confidence slowly returns because it is no longer connected to their opinions, compliments, criticism, or silence. You remember that your worth never depended on their acceptance in the first place. You are not an object waiting for someone else's permission to feel valuable. You are not a character inside another person's emotional drama. You are an independent human being with your own identity, your own future, and your own peace. That realization becomes the beginning of real freedom. Once you understand this, their ability to control you grows weaker with every passing day. And perhaps the most surprising part is this. The less energy you give to their games, the more strength you quietly reclaim for yourself. That is the moment everything truly begins to change. You are your own person, fully capable of deciding how you think, feel, and respond. No one else has the right to control your emotional world. But reaching that place is not easy. It is not a passive decision or something that happens overnight. It is one of the strongest mental choices you will ever make. It asks you to face your own desire to be accepted, your own hope that one day they will finally understand the pain they caused, and your own wish that things could somehow be different. Here is the difficult truth many people eventually discover. If you distance yourself from a narcissist, you may never receive the apology you waited so long to hear. They are unlikely to admit the damage they caused. They probably will not take responsibility in the way you hoped they would. They will rarely give you the closure you believed would finally bring peace. That reality can feel painful because it forces you to understand that your healing cannot depend on another person's honesty or self-awareness. Real healing begins when you stop waiting for them to change and start choosing yourself instead. The moment you accept that truth, something powerful begins to happen inside you. Keep watching, because the next part explains why this simple shift changes everything. There is a surprising truth hidden inside this entire experience. The harder you work to convince a narcissist to understand your pain, the more control you unknowingly give them over your emotions. Every long explanation, every emotional conversation, every attempt to prove your point keeps you emotionally connected to the same unhealthy cycle. But something remarkable happens when you finally stop trying. When you quietly step away and begin focusing on your own future, their influence starts fading. This is why walking away completely changes the balance of power. You are no longer searching for their approval, their understanding, or their permission to move forward. Without realizing it, you have removed the very thing they depended on most. Many people believe a narcissist fears being disliked, but that is usually not their greatest concern. Strong emotions still mean they occupy space in your mind. What becomes far more difficult for them is becoming emotionally irrelevant. When you truly stop caring, when their words no longer upset you, and their behavior no longer controls your mood, They lose the emotional connection they relied on. Stay with this thought, because understanding this changes how you see every interaction from this point forward. Emotional distance is powerful because it does much more than protect you from manipulation. It gives you back ownership of your inner world. Instead of spending your energy trying to predict their next move, defend yourself, or explain your feelings, you begin investing that same energy into rebuilding your own life. You stop living inside someone else's emotional storm and begin creating peace on your own terms. For many narcissists, this creates an uncomfortable situation because they are left facing feelings they have spent years avoiding. Without constant emotional reactions from other people, they may be forced to sit with their own insecurity, emptiness, or self-doubt. Even if they never admit it publicly, the absence of your attention changes something important. They may continue acting confident, successful, or unaffected in front of others. But your emotional independence quietly removes a source of validation they once counted on. That is why choosing peace is never a sign of weakness. It is one of the strongest decisions you can make. It shows that your identity no longer depends on someone else's approval. And that kind of freedom is something they often struggle to understand because it cannot be controlled or manipulated. Perhaps the most satisfying part of this journey is realizing that your greatest strength is not winning an argument or proving who was right. It is walking away with your dignity still intact. You do not need endless explanations. You do not need revenge. You do not need them to finally recognize your value. Sometimes the loudest message is complete silence. The quiet space you leave behind speaks more clearly than any emotional confrontation ever could. Once you stop participating in the same unhealthy cycle, their carefully maintained image begins facing new pressure. Their confidence often depends on outside reactions rather than lasting inner security. Without your emotional involvement, maintaining that image becomes more difficult. This is why your decision to leave can feel like such a serious loss to them. It is not only your physical absence that matters, it is the disappearance of the emotional energy they once received from your attention. That change affects the entire dynamic, whether they admit it or not. And the more peacefully you move forward, the more obvious it becomes that your life no longer revolves around their behavior. At the center of this pattern is something psychologists often describe as narcissistic supply. This refers to the attention, admiration, praise, emotional reactions, or constant focus that helps support a narcissist's inflated self-image. For many of them, this attention is not simply enjoyable. It becomes something they strongly depend on to protect a fragile sense of identity. Without a steady stream of emotional responses, uncomfortable feelings they have tried to avoid for years may begin to surface. Feelings like shame, emptiness, insecurity, or fear can become much harder to ignore. This explains why almost any emotional reaction can seem valuable to them. Love can feed it. Anger can feed it. Arguments, frustration, and emotional conversations can also keep the cycle alive, because all of them confirm that they still occupy your thoughts. But when you calmly step away and stop feeding that pattern, something important changes. The emotional supply begins disappearing, and with it, much of the influence they once believed they had over you. That quiet absence often affects them far more deeply than dramatic conflict ever could. Keep listening, because the final piece explains why this shift transforms both your future and theirs. The deepest part of this change is not simply that you leave the relationship. It is that you stop allowing someone else to define who you are. Healthy relationships are built on respect, trust, and mutual care. But for a narcissist, relationships often become centered on influence and control rather than genuine emotional connection. As long as you remained emotionally trapped, they could shape how you viewed yourself, how you reacted to their behavior, and even how you interpreted reality. Walking away changes that completely. You reclaim your confidence, you recover your voice, you begin trusting your own judgment again instead of constantly questioning yourself. At the same time, the illusion that they can endlessly control the people around them starts breaking apart. They are forced to recognize that not everyone will remain inside the role they tried to assign them. Your independence becomes living proof that manipulation has limits. And once you truly understand that your peace is worth protecting, you stop chasing validation from the very person who convinced you that you needed it. That is when real freedom begins. And it is a freedom no one can ever take away from you again. Here is something that often surprises people. In many ways, the narcissist depends on you far more than you ever depended on them. They will almost never admit this, not to you and not even to themselves. Accepting it would completely challenge the image of strength and superiority they work so hard to protect. While the end of the relationship may leave you feeling hurt, confused, or emotionally exhausted, you still possess something they struggle to find. You have an identity that can exist without someone else's constant approval. Deep inside, you have the ability to rebuild, heal, and create meaning for your own life. The narcissist, however, remains trapped inside a cycle that requires constant outside validation. They rely on other people to support the image they have created of themselves. When you leave, you remove one of the mirrors they depended on to reflect that image back to them. Suddenly, they are left facing emotions they have spent years trying to escape. That is why your decision to quietly move forward affects them more deeply than endless arguments ever could. Stay with me, because the next part explains why silence often becomes your strongest response. For a narcissist, being ignored can feel far more painful than being criticized. It is not simply an injury to their pride. It can feel like a direct threat to the identity they have built around constant attention and emotional control. Their confidence often depends on receiving reactions from the people around them. Without those reactions, uncomfortable feelings begin to rise to the surface. They may be forced to confront insecurity, shame, or an overwhelming sense of emptiness they have spent years hiding beneath confidence and control. This is why calm silence can have such a powerful impact. It quietly removes the emotional fuel they once relied on. Words can become arguments. Arguments can become new opportunities for manipulation. But emotional distance offers no opening. It simply allows you to reclaim your own peace, while leaving them to deal with feelings they cannot easily escape. That is also why many narcissists react strongly the moment they sense you pulling away. Keep listening, because what they do next often reveals far more than what they ever say. When they realize they are losing influence over you, they may suddenly change their behavior. Some become unusually charming. Others rely on guilt, emotional pressure, promises of change, or carefully planned mind games. These actions can easily look like love or regret from the outside, but they are often driven by something very different. They are attempts to regain the emotional control they once had. Instead of grieving the relationship itself, they may be reacting to the loss of the influence and validation they previously received. The more calmly you refuse to re-enter the same unhealthy cycle, the more uncomfortable that loss becomes for them. This is where your true strength begins to show. Every time you choose peace over conflict, you quietly take back another piece of your emotional freedom. They can no longer decide whether your day is good or bad. They no longer control your confidence, your happiness, or your self-worth. That shift may seem small at first, but over time it completely changes the balance of power. And perhaps the greatest victory is that it happens without needing to prove anything at all. The most important part of walking away is not what it does to the narcissist. It is what it begins to restore inside you. During the relationship, you may have spent years adjusting your words, second-guessing your decisions, and questioning your own value. You may have felt responsible for fixing problems you never created. Some days you may have even believed you could not be complete without them. But none of those beliefs reflected the truth. You were always enough. Their behavior was never proof that you lacked value. It was a reflection of struggles they carried within themselves. As you gain distance, you begin noticing how much lighter life feels. You no longer wake up wondering what mood they will be in. You stop walking on eggshells. You stop arranging your life around someone else's unpredictable emotions. Instead, your attention slowly returns to your own dreams, your own goals, and your own future. That quiet change may happen gradually, but it becomes one of the most meaningful transformations of your entire life. There will still be difficult moments. You may wonder if you should give them one more chance, or try one final conversation in the hope that this time they will finally understand. Those feelings are completely natural. But during those moments, remind yourself that your purpose is not to transform another person. Your purpose is to strengthen your relationship with yourself. Every time you choose not to respond to unnecessary conflict, you reinforce your own emotional stability. Every time you refuse to be pulled back into the same unhealthy pattern, you build another layer of confidence. Little by little, the influence they once had begins fading into the background. Their voice becomes quieter inside your mind. Their opinions lose their weight. Eventually, they become like distant background noise that no longer deserves your attention. Instead of investing your energy in endless emotional battles, you begin investing it in your own healing, your own interests, and the people who genuinely support your growth. Keep watching, because this final realization may be the most freeing part of all. It is important to remember that their desperate attempts to pull you back are not proof of healthy love. More often, they reflect the loss of the emotional validation they once received from you. By stepping away, you have closed the source they depended on, and they may struggle because they have not learned how to build lasting self-worth from within. But solving that problem has never been your responsibility. You are not their therapist. You are not their parent. You are not responsible for carrying the emotional weight they refuse to face themselves. You are your own person with your own future to create. That future belongs to you. You choose the people you welcome into your life. You decide what deserves your energy. You define your own values instead of living according to someone else's expectations. There is incredible peace in finally accepting that you cannot rescue someone who does not truly want to change. The burden you carried for so long finally begins to disappear. In its place comes space to breathe, to dream again, and to rediscover the person you always were beneath the confusion. That is one of the greatest acts of self-respect you can ever choose. You quietly tell yourself, I value my peace enough to leave behind what continually harms me. At first, the silence after leaving may feel unfamiliar because conflict had become normal. But with time, that silence becomes something beautiful. It becomes the sound of your own life returning. It becomes the sound of your confidence growing stronger. It becomes the sound of your own voice finally being heard again. For a long time, your own voice may have been buried beneath constant criticism, confusion, and emotional pressure. Now is the time to let that voice be heard again.